I don't give a damn who you think you are. Clear out of that structure before I contact the authorities. Patricia's voice cracked with indignation as she witnessed me starting a campfire on the land I'd lawfully possessed since 1988, she assumed. I was some unauthorized camper, some drifter who had no business being in the exclusive retreat zone of the Homeowners Association elite. 12 minutes later, 4 squad cars came racing to the forest entrance, emergency lights flashing, sirens piercing the air. Patricia emerged from her vehicle, gesturing frantically like she was reporting a major crime, pointing directly at me while shouting, "There's the man." But then one of the officers exited his vehicle. His gaze swept across me briefly. Then he straightened to attention, adjusted his duty belt, and rendered a crisp military salute with ceremonial precision. At that instant, everything became eerily quiet, as if the entire woodland had suddenly recognized she had committed a grave error. Drop a comment below about where you're viewing from, because occasionally the individual you assume is a nobody turns out to be the one who established the regulations you're violating. The November morning fog was lifting from Cedar Ridge when I drove my weathered Ford down the gravel path to my father's lodge. Following 37 years in the Marines, this 45-acre parcel of inherited wilderness served as my refuge. Linda used to cherish this location before the illness claimed her 3 years ago. We'd gather around the fire ring while she drew winter branches, and I pretended to study. I was here by myself, seeking the tranquility only these mountains could offer. The aged pine lodge with its brick fireplace represented something wealth couldn't purchase after decades of military duty. I was chopping firewood when an immaculate Lexus SUV glided down the access route. The operator was a brunette woman wearing expensive sunglasses, cellular device already out and filming. "Pardon me," she called without exiting her luxury vehicle. "This is restricted property. You cannot simply establish camp wherever you please." Her tone carried that privileged inflection I'd encountered previously, typically from individuals who'd never earned anything through hard work. The red recording indicator meant she was broadcasting this encounter live. "I'm going live to document this trespassing incident. We've experienced issues with vagrant individuals attempting to camp in our upscale community." I set down my hatchet and approached slowly, hands visible. Military training taught me de-escalation. Though her dramatic performance indicated she wasn't interested in reasonable dialogue, "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding here. I'm Robert Patterson, and this is my land. I have the property deed if you'd care to examine it." I reached for my wallet deliberately since she was recording everything and likely hoping I'd do something that would create compelling social media content. "I don't care what fraudulent papers you think you possess," she snapped, not glancing at the documentation. "I'm Patricia Blackwood, chairwoman of Cedar Ridge Estates, HOA, and I know every landowner here. You're not among them." She held her phone higher, capturing my face. "I'm also known as Steel Patricia to my followers, and I'm exposing another case of illegal camping in our pristine neighborhood. This individual is attempting to establish a homeless settlement on private land." The irony wasn't lost on me that she called herself Steel Patricia while accusing me of being the problem. I'd encountered her type before. People who transformed Neighborhood Watch into personal missions and social media into reality television. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand your concern, but I am the legal owner. My father, William Patterson, bequeathed this to me in 1988. Perhaps you could examine the deed." I held out the documents again, but she was too busy performing for her phone. "Nice attempt with the counterfeit papers," she said, zooming in on me. "This entire area has been under HOA control for over 2 decades. Whatever scheme you're operating ends now, contacting the police." She was already dialing emergency services, switching into victim mode. "Yes, I need officers at Cedar Ridge Forest Road immediately. Vagrant is threatening me and attempting to establish an illegal campsite. He's carrying some kind of weapon and being very aggressive and intimidating." I listened to her fabricate a threatening scenario from our polite conversation. The woman had decided I was guilty and was determined to create content regardless of the facts. "Ma'am, I haven't threatened you. I've been respectful and attempted to show legal documentation. I said clearly for her phone to record. If this became, he said, she said, I wanted facts on record. Don't gaslight me, she shrieked, having learned that term from social media. I know what you're doing. You people think you can move into decent neighborhoods and take over? Not on my watch. The phrase "you people" hung with ugly implications. This woman had made assumptions based on my work clothes and old truck that went beyond property disputes. Her live stream gained viewers rapidly. Heart reactions and comments appearing faster than she could read. I caught glimpses of messages, some supporting her brave stand against vagrant invasion, while others questioned her version. Please, sir. En route, she announced triumphantly, and we'll see who belongs in this community. She revved her Lexus unnecessarily, as if German engineering would validate her authority over the 45 acres. My family had owned since before she'd heard of Cedar Ridge. I walked back to the lodge steps, setting Linda's photograph on the wooden railing. Honey, I whispered in Spanish, learned during my first deployment. Linda would have handled this with grace and probably had Patricia Blackwood apologizing within minutes. But Linda wasn't here, and I was left dealing with whatever was coming. Down that road, 4 police cruisers rounded the bend with flashing lights and wailing sirens, creating enough drama to satisfy any influencer's viral dreams. I set Linda's picture down carefully and stood to face whatever steel Patricia had set in motion. Knowing the next few minutes would determine whether I'd get a peaceful weekend in the place my wife had loved most. What Steel Patricia didn't know was that the old jacket I was wearing had one small detail that only people in the service would recognize. The faded gold star insignia on my collar wasn't some military surplus store decoration. It was the real deal, earned through 3 decades of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. And when the right person spotted it, everything was about to change in ways that Patricia Blackwood's social media strategy had never accounted for. 4 police cruisers pulled up with enough fanfare to make Patricia's live stream dreams come true. She practically sprinted from her Lexus toward the lead car, phone held high like she was directing a movie scene. Officers, thank God you're here. This vagrant has been threatening me and refusing to leave private property. Claims to own this land, but that's impossible. She gestured dramatically toward me, playing up the victim role for her growing online audience. The comments were flying across her screen faster than she could read them. A mix of support and skepticism that she was too focused on her performance to notice. The first officer out was a Latino man in his early 40s, and I immediately noticed something about the way he carried himself. There was a slight stiffness to his right leg, the kind you develop when you're compensating for an injury that never quite healed. Military bearing was unmistakable once you'd seen enough of it, and this man had it in spades. His nameplate read Garcia, and when his eyes swept over me, they lingered for just a moment on my collar before his entire posture changed. Ma'am, if you could step back, please, Garcia said to Patricia, his voice professional but firm. Let us assess the situation. He approached me slowly, his gaze now fixed on the insignia that Patricia had dismissed as irrelevant. When he got close enough to confirm what he was seeing, something remarkable happened. This seasoned police officer, this man who probably dealt with difficult people every single day, suddenly snapped to attention with the kind of precision you only see in military ceremonies. Colonel Patterson, Garcia's voice cracked slightly as he rendered a perfect salute. His right hand sharp against his forehead, his left leg trembling slightly with the effort of standing perfectly straight. The forest went dead quiet except for the sound of Patricia's live stream continuing to record what was rapidly becoming a very different story than she'd planned to tell. Sir, it's an honor. I'm Sergeant Garcia, formerly of the 2nd Marine Division. Patricia's phone nearly slipped from her hands. The confident smirk she'd been wearing for her audience melted into confusion, then shock, then something that looked suspiciously like panic. Her viewers were exploding with questions and reactions, the comment feed becoming a waterfall of weight. What? And oh snap, and Patricia's about to get schooled? She tried to maintain her composure, but you could see the wheels turning as she realized her vagrant was some kind of military officer. Garcia, I said, returning his salute before extending my hand. At ease, son. It's good to see you. The name had clicked the moment he'd identified his unit, 2nd Marines, Iraq 2019. You were the sergeant who got hit by that IED outside Fallujah. The memory came flooding back, that terrible day when his convoy hit a roadside bomb and his right leg got mangled so badly that we thought we'd lose him. How's the leg holding up? Better every day, thanks to you, sir, Garcia replied, his voice thick with emotion. The other officers had gotten out of their cars by now and were watching this exchange with growing understanding. You carried me 2 miles back to the base. When the medevac couldn't land, Doc said another hour and I would have bled out. He turned toward Patricia, and the temperature in his voice dropped about 40 degrees. Ma'am, do you have any documentation proving your authority over this property? Steele? Patricia's live stream was now completely out of her control. What had started as brave citizen confronts dangerous vagrant had turned into Patricia harasses decorated military hero, and her comment section was reflecting that shift in real time. Well, I'm the HOA chairwoman, she stammered, suddenly. Realizing that her usual tactics weren't going to work against facts, this entire area falls under our jurisdiction. You can't just squat here illegally. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some documentation of your claims, Garcia said, his tone now purely professional. Because what I'm seeing here is a property owner on his land being harassed by someone with a cell phone. He gestured toward me. Colonel Patterson, do you have your property documentation available? I pulled out the deed and survey maps, the same documents that Patricia had refused to look at during her dramatic performance. Garcia examined them carefully, his trained eye picking up details that Patricia's entitled assumptions had missed. Property. Purchased in 1988. Taxes current. Survey boundaries marked. Sir, this appears to be completely legitimate. Patricia's face was cycling through several shades of red as she realized her social media victory was turning into a very public humiliation. Her live stream viewers were now pushing the hashtag Steele Patricia V's Colonel. And based on the comments I could see over her shoulder, public opinion was not swinging in her direction. This is ridiculous. I know every property owner in Cedar Ridge. Estates, he's lying about something. Ma'am, Garcia said, his patience wearing thin. I'm going to ask you one more time for documentation supporting your claims. If you can't provide a legal basis for your authority over this property, then you're the one who's trespassing. The other officers were nodding in agreement, and I could see Patricia's confident facade finally beginning to crack under the weight of actual law enforcement scrutiny. Garcia turned back to me with something that looked like relief mixed with respect. Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience this situation has caused. Is there anything else you need from us today? But Patricia wasn't finished with her performance yet, and I had a feeling this confrontation was just getting started. Patricia thought that hiring a $900 per hour attorney would handle this problem? She had no idea that the man she was up against had co-authored the military manual on property rights disputes and had spent more time in legal briefings than she'd spent watching reality television. But Patricia Blackwood was about to learn that when you mess with someone who understands both the law and human nature, you better come prepared for a fight that goes way beyond social media theatrics. Within 24 hours of her humiliating live stream defeat, Patricia had mobilized what she probably thought was an impressive legal arsenal. Her attorney, Marcus Blake from the prestigious firm of Blake, Sterling and Associates, showed up at my lodge the next morning in a Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses. He was everything you'd expect from an expensive lawyer, a perfectly tailored suit, a briefcase that probably had its own insurance policy, and that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to face real consequences for being wrong. Mr. Patterson, Blake announced, not bothering with pleasantries. My client, Mrs. Blackwood, has retained me to resolve this property dispute. We have reason to believe you're occupying this land illegally, and we're prepared to pursue all available legal remedies. He handed me a thick envelope with the kind of flourish that suggested he thought legal documents were somehow intimidating to someone who'd spent decades dealing with military bureaucracy. That's a cease and desist order requiring you to vacate these premises within 72 hours. I opened the envelope and scanned the documents, noting several interesting details that Mr. Blake had missed in his rush to intimidate me. This is fascinating, I said, looking up at him with what I hoped was an appropriately impressed expression. Tell me, did you research the property boundaries before filing this, or were you just taking your client's word for everything? Document claimed I was squatting on HOA common land, which would have been compelling if it weren't complete nonsense. Mrs. Blackwood has been the HOA chairwoman for over a decade, Blake replied stiffly. She knows every inch of this community. Behind him, I could see Patricia sitting in her Lexus. I'll be live streaming this encounter as part 2 of her legal drama series. Your alleged ownership documents are outdated and superseded by the community development agreements established. In 2004, interesting theory, I said, pulling out my documentation. However, you might want to check the county recorder's office. My deed predates your HOA by 16 years, and there's something called grandfathered rights that your law school probably covered in Property Law 101. I handed him my survey maps and deed copy. You'll also notice that my property taxes have been current every year since 1988, which tends to establish a pretty clear chain of ownership. Blake's confident expression wavered as he read my documents for the first time. I could practically see him calculating how much research his firm should have done before taking Patricia's money and making threats they couldn't back up. We'll need to verify these documents, he said, his voice losing some of its courtroom authority. There may be zoning issues or environmental restrictions that supersede individual ownership rights. You're right to be thorough, I agreed pleasantly. While you're doing that research, you might want to look into Mrs. Blackwood's authority to make representations about property that she doesn't own. There are some interesting laws about filing false documents and making fraudulent claims. Seen enough legal intimidation tactics in the military to recognize amateur hour when it walked up to my door? Patricia must have gotten tired of watching from her car because she suddenly appeared beside her lawyer, phone already recording. He's stalling and trying to confuse the legal issues, she announced to her audience. Mr. Blake just explained to him that we have community standards and he can't just ignore them. She was trying to regain control of the narrative, but there was something desperate in her voice that suggested yesterday's public humiliation was still stinging. Mrs. Blackwood, Blake said carefully. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. He was realizing that his client's social media strategy and legal strategy were working at cross purposes. Nothing kills a strong legal position faster than having your client live stream herself making claims that aren't supported by facts. But Patricia was too invested in her performance to take the hint. I've been protecting this community from undesirable elements for years, she continued, apparently forgetting that she was talking about a decorated military officer. We have standards here, and we can't just let anyone move in and lower our property values. The classist undertones that had been simmering beneath the surface were now becoming explicit. That evening, I received an email that was meant to intimidate me into leaving quietly. It claimed to be from the law offices of Marcus Blake and threatened criminal prosecution for trespassing, vandalism, threatening behavior toward community residents. The problem was real lawyers don't usually send threatening emails from Gmail accounts. And the legal terminology was just wrong enough to suggest someone had been copying and pasting from legal websites without really understanding what they were reading. I forwarded the email to my daughter Rachel, who happened to be a partner at a real law firm in Denver. Her response came back within an hour. Dad, this is either a fake lawyer or the worst real lawyer in Colorado. Die. Also, why didn't you tell me you were having property issues? I've been hoping for an excuse to come visit. Sometimes the best weapon against legal intimidation is actual legal knowledge. And Patricia had just picked a fight with someone whose family happened to include actual attorneys. The next morning brought another surprise. A county inspector showed up claiming there were irregularities with my building permits that required immediate attention. When I asked who had filed the complaint, he mentioned that it came from concerned community members, but couldn't provide specifics. It was becoming clear that Patricia was working multiple angles, using her HOA connections to create bureaucratic pressure where legal intimidation had failed. But Mrs. Blackwood didn't know that attacking a retired colonel meant she'd just declared war on someone who understood strategy, logistics, and the value of having good intelligence about your opponent's weaknesses. When the words, "Colonel Patterson being harassed," appeared on the Veterans United Facebook group, an entire brotherhood woke up. Patricia had no idea that targeting a retired colonel wasn't just picking on one old man in the woods. She was about to discover that the military creates bonds that don't break when you hang up the uniform, and some fights you just can't win. With lawyers and live streams, when you're facing people who've learned teamwork under actual fire, the first sign that something had shifted came at dawn on Thursday morning. I was making coffee when I heard the rumble of motorcycle engines coming down the forest road. It's not just one or two bikes, but what sounded like a convoy. By the time I stepped outside, 15 Harley-Davidsons were pulling into my clearing. Riders wearing leather vests covered in military patches. Leading the group was Tommy Bulldog Martinez, a master sergeant I'd served with in Afghanistan, grinning like weed. Just pulled off a successful mission. "Morning, Colonel," Bulldog called out, dismounting his bike with the fluid motion of someone who'd been riding longer than he'd been walking. "Heard you were having some trouble with the local Homeowners Association. Thought you might need some community support." Behind him, the other riders were setting up folding chairs and a camping table like they'd done this operation 1,000 times before. "Hope you don't mind, but word gets around in the veteran community when one of our own gets hassled." Within an hour, my quiet forest retreat had transformed into something that looked like a military reunion crossed with a camping festival. More vehicles kept arriving, not just motorcycles, but pickup trucks, RVs, cars with veteran license plates from 4 different states. Each new arrival brought stories about how they'd heard about my situation through the veteran network. That operates faster and more efficiently than any social media algorithm. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia's attempts to use social media against me had backfired spectacularly. Her original live stream had been shared in veteran groups with commentary that was decidedly unsympathetic to her cause. Screenshots of her calling me a vagrant and demanding that I produce identification were generating the kind of outrage that people feel when they see someone disrespecting their family, because that's what military service creates. A family that extends far beyond blood relations. "Sir, you might want to see this," said Maria Santos, a former Army communications specialist who'd set up what appeared to be a mobile command center, complete with laptops and satellite internet. "Your HOA chairwoman is having a very bad week." Online, she turned her screen toward me, showing Patricia's social media accounts. Her follower count was dropping by the hundreds, and the comments on her recent posts were overwhelmingly negative. #StealPatricia Vice Colonel was trending, but not in the way she'd hoped. The real shift in momentum came when Rachel's car pulled up around noon. I hadn't seen my daughter in over a year, our relationship strained by decades of military deployments that had prioritized duty over family dinners. But there she was, stepping out of her BMW in her expensive Denver lawyer suit, looking around at the organized chaos of veterans setting up camp in support of her father. "Dad," she said, and for a moment we just stood there awkwardly. Then Bulldog whistled sharply and called out, "Attention!" Every veteran in the clearing immediately stopped what they were doing and snapped to attention, facing Rachel and me. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the trees. "Sir," Bulldog said formally, "your daughter has arrived." It was a gesture of respect that military families understand, acknowledging both the sacrifice of service and the cost it extracts from the people who love soldiers. Rachel's composure cracked slightly. "Jesus, Dad, you never told me about this." She gestured at the assembled group of people who'd dropped everything to support someone they considered family. "I mean, I knew you were respected, but this—" Her voice trailed off as she realized that her father's military service had created connections that went far beyond anything her law firm could understand. "Daughter," I said quietly, "there are some things that can't be explained, only experienced. These people understand loyalty in ways that most civilians never will." I put my hand on her shoulder, feeling some of the distance that had grown between us start to close. "Your mother always said that military families serve too, even when they don't wear the uniform." The afternoon brought news that Patricia's support within the HOA was crumbling. Mrs. Chen, an elderly board member who'd always been intimidated by Patricia's aggressive leadership style, had called to apologize for the harassment and to inform me that several HOA members were demanding an emergency meeting to discuss Patricia's conduct. Attacking a decorated veteran wasn't the kind of community leadership that everyone could support, but The most significant development came when Bulldog approached me with a serious expression. "Colonel, you need to know something. Few of the guys did some reconnaissance on your HOA chairwoman," handed me a folder. "Turns out, Mrs. Blackwood has been creative with the community funds, property management contracts that happen to go to companies she has financial interests in, and maintenance fees that seem high compared to the actual work performed. Nothing. That would normally get investigated unless someone knew where to look." I opened the folder and scanned the financial documents that Bulldog's reconnaissance had uncovered. It wasn't evidence of massive fraud, but it was definitely evidence of someone who'd been using their position for personal benefit. "Thanks. How exactly did you get these documents?" "Let's just say that one of our guys works in county administration and has access to public records." Bulldog replied with the kind of innocent expression that suggested there was more to the story. Amazing what you can find when you know how to ask the right questions in the right offices. Patricia Blackwood had started this fight thinking she was dealing with one isolated old man who could be intimidated into leaving quietly. She was about to discover that she'd picked a battle with a community that understood both loyalty and justice, and that some wars can't be won with lawyers and social media when your opponents know how to conduct actual intelligence operations. When Patricia realized she couldn't win with law or public opinion, she decided to stop playing by any rules at all. She was going to attack the one thing she thought would destroy me completely, my military service record, turning the very thing that had earned respect into a weapon against me. But Patricia Blackwood was about to learn that when you try to destroy someone's honor, better make sure you understand exactly who you're dealing with and what kind of allies. They've made over 3 decades of service. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinated with the kind of precision that Patricia probably thought made her a strategic genius. First, a story appeared in the Cedar Ridge community newsletter suggesting that I might be suffering from combat-related psychological issues that made me a potential danger to the community. The article didn't name me directly, but the references to unstable veterans and PTSD episodes were aimed at undermining the respect that Garcia's salute had generated. The same day, Tricia hired Thompson Investigative Services, a private detective firm that specialized in what their website euphemistically called background verification for community safety. Their job was to dig through my military record, looking for anything that could be twisted into evidence that I was unfit to live among decent people. Patricia was betting that 37 years of military service would include something, anything, that could be taken out of context and used to paint me as dangerous. What she didn't know was that Marcus Webb, the investigator she'd hired, was a former military intelligence officer who'd worked with my unit during 2 separate deployments. Marcus had been the one who'd helped us identify IED networks in Afghanistan. His work had saved more American lives than Patricia could count. When he received her contract and realized who his target was supposed to be, Marcus made a decision. That demonstrated the difference between loyalty that's bought and loyalty that's earned. "Colonel Patterson," Marcus said when he called me that evening, "I thought you should know that Mrs. Blackwood has hired me to investigate your military service record. She's looking for anything that might suggest you're psychologically unstable or have a history of violence." His voice carried the kind of controlled anger that comes from watching someone attack a person you respect. She specifically asked me to focus on any incidents involving civilian casualties or disciplinary actions. I wasn't surprised by Patricia's tactics, but I was impressed by her complete misunderstanding of how military intelligence networks function. "Marcus, I appreciate the heads up." "What did you tell her?" The irony of hiring a former intelligence officer to investigate someone he'd worked with wasn't lost on either of us. I told her that thorough investigations take time and that she should expect my preliminary report in 2 weeks, Marcus replied. "What I didn't tell her is that my report is going to be very thorough indeed, including documentation of her request to fabricate evidence if I couldn't find any real problems." The satisfaction in his voice suggested that Patricia had just handed him everything he needed to destroy her credibility permanently, but Patricia's nuclear option was still building momentum. She'd managed to get a local television reporter interested in a story about veteran mental health and community safety, obviously hoping to generate negative coverage that would force me to leave quietly. The reporter Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News had been fed a story about how ASS needed to be more careful about who they allowed into their communities, with obvious implications about my presence in Cedar Ridge. The interview was scheduled for Friday afternoon, and I could see Patricia's plan. She would present herself as a concerned community leader, trying to balance compassion for veterans with safety for families, while subtly suggesting that my presence represented a risk that responsible people couldn't ignore. It was character assassination, disguised as civic responsibility. Then at 3 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, everything changed in a way that Patricia hadn't planned and couldn't control. I woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of bulldogs shouting from outside my lodge. The old electrical system that I'd been meaning to upgrade had finally given up, and flames were already consuming the kitchen and spreading toward the living room, where Linda's photographs and our 30 years of memories were stored. The volunteer fire department arrived within 15 minutes, but it was too late to save the lodge. Bulldog and several other veterans had managed to get me out safely, but everything inside was lost. Standing in my boxer shorts and a borrowed jacket, watching 3 decades of memories turn to ash, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with property damage. Linda's sketches, our wedding photos, the letters she'd written during my deployments, all of it was gone. But as the fire crew worked to contain the blaze, they discovered something that my father had hidden 70 years ago. The stone foundation of the lodge had been built around a small underground storage area, a root cellar that had been converted into a fireproof safe room. Inside that hidden space was a metal strongbox that had survived not just the fire, but decades of weather and time. When we opened the box the next morning, what we found changed everything. My father's real will, not the simplified version that had been filed with the county, along with original survey maps and land purchase documents dating back to 1928. But more importantly, there were detailed records of every transaction involving the Cedar Ridge area, including documentation that proved the HOA's property claims were based on forged documents filed in 1995. Patricia had hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my past, not knowing that the investigator was already on my side. She tried to destroy my reputation with lies about mental instability, not realizing that her financial crimes were already being documented, and now, thanks to a fire that she hadn't caused but that had revealed evidence she'd spent decades trying to hide, Patricia Blackwood was about to discover that some battles can't be won when the truth finally comes to light. Rachel, you need to call your mother, I thought, remembering the hint she'd dropped about needing her daughter's help, because Patricia was going to need a good lawyer and not the kind she'd been hiring to intimidate her neighbors. What my father had hidden in that fireproof strongbox wasn't just a will. It was evidence of a fraud that had been running for 27 years. The documents proved that Patricia Blackwood hadn't just been lying about my property rights. She'd been running a sophisticated scam that had stolen land from multiple families and funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into her accounts. But more importantly, these papers were going to give me the platform to end this war in the most public way possible. The real estate documents in my father's strongbox told a story that Patricia had spent decades trying to bury. In 1928, my great-grandfather had purchased not just the 45 acres where my lodge stood, but an additional 280 acres that encompassed most of what was now Cedar Ridge Estates. The HOA development had been built on land that legally belonged to my family, using forged transfer documents that dated back to 1995, right around the time Tricia had first gotten involved in community leadership. Rachel spent Thursday morning at the county recorder's office, cross-referencing the documents we'd found with official records. What she discovered was even more damaging than we'd initially realized. "Dad, this isn't just about your property," she said, spreading copies across the makeshift table that Bulldog had set up in the clearing where my lodge used to stand. "Patricia has been systematically filing false ownership claims and collecting HOA fees on land that was never legally part of the development." The financial records were equally devastating. For over 22 years, Patricia had been collecting monthly HOA fees from residents who thought they were paying for community maintenance and improvements. Instead, much of that money had been diverted into accounts controlled by companies that existed only on paper, companies that happened to be owned by Patricia Blackwood's various business entities. The landscaping contracts, security services, and property management fees had all been inflated and redirected to benefit Patricia personally, but the most damning evidence was a series of recorded phone calls that my father had made in 1995, when he'd first discovered what Patricia was planning. Dad had been old-school suspicious of anyone trying to change property boundaries, and he'd documented every conversation he'd had with county officials, lawyers, and Patricia herself. The recordings made it clear that Patricia had known from the beginning that she was stealing land, and that she'd planned to wait until my father died before implementing her scheme. "Colonel, you need to see this," said Maria Santos, looking up from her laptop with an expression of barely contained outrage. Mrs. Blackwood's social media accounts from 2020 show her bragging about acquiring additional community assets through strategic negotiation. She's been treating this like a business accomplishment. The screenshots showed Patricia posting about her success in expanding HOA authority and protecting property values through decisive leadership by Friday afternoon. I'd made a decision that would have made my father proud. Instead of handling this quietly through lawyers and backroom negotiations, I was going to give Patricia Blackwood the public accountability she'd been so eager to create with her live streams. I called Jennifer Walsh at Channel 7 News and told her that I had information about HOA fraud that would make her veteran mental health story look like small-town gossip. The press conference was scheduled for Saturday morning in the clearing where my lodge had been. Word spread through the veteran community and social media faster than wildfire, and by 9 a.m., we had news crews from 3 different stations, a reporter from the regional newspaper, and about 250 people who'd come to witness what Bulldog was calling the reckoning. Patricia arrived in her Lexus right on schedule, apparently thinking she was going to continue her campaign of character assassination in front of the cameras. She had her phone out and was already live streaming her approach to what she thought would be my final humiliation. "I'm here to provide context for whatever lies this unstable veteran is planning to tell," she announced to her remaining followers. "The community needs to hear the truth about what happened here." What happened next was the kind of public devastation that social media was designed to capture and preserve forever. With news cameras rolling and Patricia's live stream broadcasting to her followers, I methodically presented every piece of evidence we'd uncovered. The forged property transfers, the diverted HOA funds, the recorded conversations from 1995, and the business records showing how Patricia had been stealing from her neighbors for decades. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, looking directly at her as she stood frozen beside her car, "you called me a vagrant and demanded that I prove my right to exist in this community. Well, here's my proof." I held up the original deed and survey maps. This entire development was built on land that my family has owned since 1928. Every HOA fee you've collected, every assessment you've levied, every family you've intimidated into selling their homes, it was all based on a lie. Patricia's live stream captured her complete breakdown in real time. The confident community leader persona crumbled as she realized that her 27-year calm was being exposed to news cameras and broadcast live to anyone still following her social media accounts. "You can't prove any of this," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction because she could see the documents and recordings that proved everything. "Mrs. Blackwood, we can prove all of it," Rachel said, stepping forward with a folder thick with legal papers. "We've already filed complaints with the district attorney's office, the State Real Estate Commission, and the IRS. Your little empire is over." The lawyer in her was enjoying the complete reversal of leverage that had taken place since Wednesday morning, but the moment that broke Patricia completely came when